Great.
All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the 14th annual Brown Bagger Series. I looked that up today. We started this back in 2004, and we have been steady doing it once a year ever since then. So today is session 3 of this year's Brown Bagger, and it's the title, the overall title is the National Cattle Evaluation, Charting a Course for Continued Genetic Improvement. Would like to remind everyone that that we still do have the website up and running, and that's where this material will be housed, and that's the same, www.NBCEC.org. Would also encourage you, if you're looking for some current information, fact sheets, things like that, to also go and check out eBEEF.org. It's a website that that we're heavily involved in too, and I would like to thank also my co-coordinators of the Education Committee, and that is Dr. Bob Weber at K-State, who you're going to hear from in just a little bit, and Dr. Matt Spangler at the University of Nebraska. The three of us have been coordinating this for a number of years now. It's kind of funny, I need to mention, we started this with strobing back in 2004 when this started, and I heard from Daryl today he's back actually teaching a class at Iowa State now on a part-time basis. So it's good to hear from strobing this morning. I'm your host. My name's Darrell Bullock. I'm at the University of Kentucky. And today's session is we're going to be discussing new Type-Trait EPDs. We continue to try and add to our suite of traits. I know that some people think, well, we have too many traits already. Well, for any one individual that's trying to pinpoint certain needs, they probably don't need to look at all the traits that are available for EPDs, but we would like to give them an option to look at whatever traits they feel is valuable to their operation. We have two excellent speakers today, Dr. Bob Weber and Dr. Heather Bradford as well, and so we're going to jump right in. I'll introduce Heather in a little bit, but we'll start with Bob. And Bob, it was kind of funny when I looked back at my files from that first Brown Bagger. You were a speaker on the first Brown Bagger. You were actually still a graduate student at Cornell at the time, but I'd forgot that you were. I knew you had done it for us back at that time, but I forgot that was actually the very first Brown Bagger that we had done. So just a little bit, and you guys know a lot about Bob. He's at K-State University currently, and he's a cow-calf extension specialist and also the faculty coordinator for the K-State Purebred unit. The focus of Bob's extension and research programs have been to broaden the availability, the use, and understanding of genetic selection tools like EPDs, DNA markers, and also selection indexes. And he's also done a lot with performance data collection schemes that can be implemented by beef producers. Just a couple of things, and Bob, this one, I'll say Bob won the Midwest section of the American Society of Animal Sciences Young Animal Science Extension Award back in 2013. So I guess in 13 you were still young, Bob, but I think you've given up that now. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Bob's going to talk to us about update on structure EPD development.
Thanks, Dare, and I did appreciate the addition of the Young Award winner part, because you were starting to give away how not young we are. So
I stopped sharing, so I think it should be up for you to be able to grab now.
Okay. All right, how's that, Dare? Got
Yep.
Title slide update on structure EPD development?
That's what I see.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Dare, for the nice introduction and not divulging too much on the age front, but the hair is thinning noticeably. So, but glad to work with you and Matt, and happy to present today on what I think is some interesting research that we've been working on here at K-State, and connected to a couple of breed associations in an area that, as an extension specialist, and particularly now connected to our purebred beef unit here, routinely get some phone calls from either seed stock producers or commercial producers regarding feet and leg quality and what we might be able to do to improve those traits. I know several years ago we had a severe drought in a fair bit of Kansas, and some feet and leg issues generated from that were largely environmental in nature, but certainly helped stimulate some discussion about feet and leg quality and how we might improve the structural aspects of our beef cattle. And I think over time, one of the things that's maybe happened is we've put a lot of selection emphasis on a variety of traits that we have EPDs for, so calving ease and birth and weaning and yearling and milk and carcass traits. And in some ways that maybe has diluted some of our attention and selection pressure that we would place on more conventional selection attributes like conformation and phenotype. And there's probably a balance we need to strike in there somewhere to make sure that animals are adequate in terms of their structural soundness to perform in their intended production environments. And I know I've been an advocate of using the EPD tools, but frequently include a little comment in there that it's not the only tool in the toolbox. And we do need to pay attention to some traits that are outside the suite of EPDs that are currently published. So I know Dr. Bradford and Dr. Mosier and Dr. Borman and I worked on some teat and udder stuff that Heather's going to talk about in a little bit. But these traits all sort of lie at the periphery of new trait development, but really speak, I think, quite well to some of the longevity and productivity issues we face in beef production. And with the accelerated costs of replacement female development, certainly making sure that cows and certainly from the bull purchase standpoint, bull prices are still at near all-time high levels on average. There's some elevated expectations about the performance of the seed stock we produce, and making sure they live up to those from a structure and longevity standpoint is probably something we should think about. So as we kind of move into the talk here, a little bit of overview, we're going to talk specifically about some feet and leg structural literature and what's out there in terms of scientific publications, and then talk specifically about the work that we've done here in the last couple of years at K-State on this particular topic. So we mentioned the importance of longevity just a minute ago. We know that keeping and maintaining a cow herd that produces a high percentage of calves helps balance out the cost of replacement female production. And we know from a variety of literature that somewhere around 6 years of age is the break-even point for a cow to pay back her capital investment. So making sure that a large portion of cows make it to 6 years or older in our commercial settings is really important to help ensure our producers are able to minimize their investment on the cow side or replacement female development as a strategy to improve sustainability and profitability. There's a fair body of knowledge existing on the dairy side related to structure and type traits, and certainly foot and leg quality falls into those. So a little bit of a snapshot here. Foot angle, heritability estimates range from basically 0.1 to 0.13. Rear leg side view, so this is hock set, somewhere between 0.15 and 0.25. Rear leg rear view, so this is standing behind the animal. Do they hock in or hock out? 0.06 to 0.11. And then some composite scores of is this animal overall structurally sound or not, ranges between 0.13 and 0.4. So the literature suggests, at least in dairy cattle, the heritability estimates are low to maybe modest at best, but certainly some genetic control of those traits. There's some other literature I'm aware of on the beef side that suggests other traits like body length and height and stature, rib depth, all of those have substantially higher heritability estimates, some in the 0.3 to 0.6 range. And so we know that phenotypic selection on those traits has worked for a long time. And it's worked because there's an underlying heritable component to those traits. And we know that if we select animals that are taller, they get taller over time. We know if we select animals that have straighter or more hock set on the rear legs, they have a tendency to pass that to their offspring. So we've known for quite a while that there's a heritable component to these traits. There's also some interesting work on the dairy side that I think is really important and motivates us to do some additional work that I'll talk about at the end of the presentation to look at the genetic relationships between the type or structure traits and longevity and productivity. So Jack Deckers at Iowa State in the mid-90s published some work, and there's a number of other studies as well that look at the relationship in dairy cattle between particularly udder conformation and feet and leg structure and the productivity and longevity of dairy cows. And we know those cows in a relatively stressful environment, predominantly on concrete, that if they don't have good solid feet and legs under them, that diminishes their longevity and productivity as cows. We also know in dairy cattle, though, that longevity tends to be a lowly heritable trait, but just because it's lowly heritable doesn't mean that we shouldn't go after it. And in fact, traits like longevity or stayability, although low heritability estimates have significant impacts on system-level profitability often. So in the beef industry, we'll get kind of focused on beef cattle here. Australian Angus Association has been kind of a little bit of a pioneer in this area, looking at feet and leg structure. They accumulated in the early 2010s, that decade, about 10,000 or more individual animals phenotyped for 6 or 7 feet and leg traits to begin to produce a national cattle evaluation for feet and leg traits. And some really interesting work in looking at different modeling approaches between linear and threshold. We won't dive too far into that, but mostly want to point out that they now publish, as part of their routine genetic evaluations, 5 EBVs, so estimated breeding values for feet and leg traits, so front foot angle and claw shape, rear foot angle, rear leg side view, so this is the amount of set to the hock and hip, and rear leg view, sort of the cow in or cow out when viewed from behind. The heritability estimates on the linear scale that they published were mostly in the near 0.2 to 0.3 across those traits. And so some nice work demonstrating that we can, in fact, produce an effective national cattle evaluation and selection tools based on phenotypic evaluation of these traits. And they used a 1 to 9 categorical system and make some substantial headway in helping producers understand these traits and make improvement. One of the things we routinely run into is some challenges. There's kind of a newer generation of folks that may be involved in seed stock production that didn't have either 4-H FFA or collegiate experience in livestock evaluation. And so sometimes they don't know what good structure is. And we think providing an effective tool both helps elevate the trait as an important one, but also helps give them some direction in what traits or what genetic predictions might be useful for them to select for. So right now in the U.S., there's not a genetic evaluation published for feet and leg traits. American Angus Association has been working actively to gather a large amount of foot angle and claw shape data from its members and actively pursuing that. We had an opportunity here at K-State to submit for some internal funding through our Global Food Systems Initiative that required collaborative extramural funding and collaborative support. And so we approached the Red Angus and Simmental Associations to help support that project, and they in fact have helped fund this project. And our goal was then to collect phenotypic information on Red Angus and Simmental bulls and females and use that to calculate genetic parameters for feet and leg structure in those two breeds. And we also wanted to investigate the relationships between those structural traits and other feet and leg traits, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and some production attributes. So can we connect it to differences in productivity or longevity from a genetics perspective. So the traits that we measured, we expanded the suite of traits because we know that both anatomically and I think genetically, there are connections between various limb angles and the resulting foot and hoof structure. And so we wanted to investigate, could we provide better data in terms of leg structure, shoulder and hip orientation, to provide indicator trait data to the hoof characteristics. The hoof ends up being sort of a reflection of the other attributes of the animal in terms of leg and limb structure. So we collected 14 traits listed here to sort of get at that, and we scored front and rear legs separately because we were interested in what is the genetic association, say, between front foot hoof angle and rear foot hoof angle, and rear and front claw shape and so forth. So that required that we score these separately. We also wanted to score the data on a continuous scale rather than strictly categorical. So we used a 0 to 100 scoring system and an online, we have an institutional subscription to Qualtrics, which is an online web survey tool. But it provides a nice offline mobile device application, so we could use a tablet a computer out in the field to actually score the data. And so this is just a picture of the first screen of that. We had several different scores to collect the data. We used collected body condition score on the cows. And then you'll see here we've got, this was BCS scored 0 to 10, and the little red dot's a slider bar. So you just touch the screen and drag it to wherever you want. And that provides continuous data versus somebody typing in strictly a categorical value. When we went to the feet and legs, so we would score several attributes, say on the front foot, hoof angle and heel depth, and we used some images that help provide a rubric to score those against. Although these were the 1 to 9 category, gives us sort of the benchmarks of 10 to 90 to score against. And we went through in at least 2 scores on every animal for all 14 traits. Here's front foot shape or claw shape. So were they open and divergent or a corkscrew claw? It took somewhere, once we got up and rolling, somewhere between about 2 and maybe 3.5 minutes per animal to score them. And so it's a fairly time consuming effort, but we wanted to sort of get really deep phenotyping done so we could provide some good recommendations to these 2 particular breed associations on what a condensed system might look like based on those genetic associations. So here's an example of some not very good front feet. You'll see here the inside clove is starting to roll over and curl. And this particular one happens to be because that animal's splay-footed, so it turns out pretty dramatically on the front end, and that puts a lot of weight on that inside clove. Here's the rear foot scoring system, virtually identical in terms of the pictures we use, but here's a set of rear feet that are kind of shallow-heeled and long-toed. Here's another one that's in the same kind of condition and starting to curl a little bit. So these would be in terms of heel depth and in the 80s or 90s probably, and toe length, kind of in that same category. Front claw or rear foot claw shape, a similar thing. Here's starting to be a corkscrew claw, so it's starting to curl. The outside hoof walls growing underneath the foot. A pretty undesirable feature in bulls and cows. Here's another one that's a fairly extreme case as well. So I mentioned we wanted to capture some limb angulation information, so we scored front feet side view. So this is mostly to capture shoulder angle. Are they straight shouldered, which has a tendency to make them at extreme levels buck-kneed. If they have a lot of set to their shoulder, they eventually get to a condition where the knee joint provides some additional flex and become calf-kneed. On the rear leg, we scored also the knee and hoof orientation viewed from the front, so they turn in or turn out. Here's that same foot we saw earlier, but a little broader view, and you can tell that animal is pretty splay-footed on the front end. On the rear critter, we used some images to capture hock and hip set. So kind of the traditional, are they really post-legged behind or really sickle hock from the side? Do they bow out or cow in when viewed from behind? So you can tell it takes a while to get through even just describing all those, let alone actually scoring them. So we did have at least 2 trained observers evaluate each animal. We did average the scores in our genetic evaluation, but we have investigated the intra-observer variation as well. And all animals that were included in the evaluation had to have, obviously, a registration number, in this case with Red Angus, for the Red Angus evaluation, so we could tie to a pedigree structure that they provided to us. So after edits, about 1,700 animals included in this prototype evaluation. And Red Angus Association of America provided us a 3-generation pedigree that included about 13,000 animals, and about 3,200 of those were direct sires of the calves evaluated. So we got a pretty big slice of the Red Angus pedigree in this system. So just a real quick look at some of the distributional attributes of the data. We did score bulls and females. Most of the bulls that we collected were either yearling or 2-year-old bulls being prepared for sale, so moving into the commercial sector. And in the female side, this represented these producers, predominantly their active cow herd, but in some cases we were able to score yearling or bred heifers as well. Here's some distribution data for front hoof angle, rear hoof angle, heel depth, front and rear. And what you'll notice is in general, these sort of accumulate kind of in the middle of the scoring rubric. So we hesitate to use the word ideal, but somewhere around 50 is sort of typically viewed as what's the ideal phenotype for these traits. That's based on just our visual observation and not necessarily what's ideal from an economic or selection standpoint. So we try not to point ideal too much, but these had means that were near 50 anyway. Here's claw shape distribution, so front and rear. Front side view, so these cattle on average tended to be a little straight shouldered compared to the rubric, so they tended to be on that side of 50. Front hoof orientation, they had a tendency to toe out just a little bit, but we're pretty correct in terms of knee structure. We also scored a composite score, so at the very end we said, was the animal, in our opinion, structurally correct or not, with 0 being extremely unstructurally correct, or in this case, a 50 was an animal that we might hypothesize as ideal or perfect in terms of structural correctness. And most of the animals landed somewhere above 25, but in the kind of 30 to 35 range was pretty typical. So for the genetic evaluation, I won't bore you with too many of these details, but we ran the data through sort of a typical analysis software called ASREML. And we ran the data in pairs of traits. So we conducted 169, I should say, Brady Jensen specifically ran this part of the evaluation, 169 bivariate models. And then we accumulated the mean estimates of additive and residual variances across all the informative bivariate models for each trait. We needed a covariance estimate, so that's why we had to do the bivariate models. But each one of those bivariate models provided us some information about the additive and residuals for each trait included. So we accumulated that information over all the possible combinations. EPDs for front and rear limb models for all animals in the pedigree were produced to use in some further evaluation. And we calculated heritability in the traditional way. So some of the results, here's the heritability estimates and their standard errors. So front hoof angle and heel depth around 0.2. Front claw shape was surprisingly a little bit lower than some of the other traits at 0.09. Rear hoof angle and depth between, say, 0.17 and 0.25. Hoof size, so we evaluated were they big-footed or small-footed. Heritability of 0.36. front side view, knee orientation, so forth, around between 0.15 and 0.2. Rear side view, so this is hock set. Are they sickle hocked or post-legged behind? The heritability of about 0.3. And then our composite score, a little surprising to me, had a heritability of around 0.12. I thought we might do a little better job on that one, but maybe lots of bias in terms of observer what is good. So I want to take us through real quickly the excuse me, the phenotypic and genetic correlations. You can imagine excuse me, this matrix is really big because there's 14 traits. Brady Jensen did a nice job sort of breaking this up for us in 4 separate slides. So we'll start through and go through them 1 through 4. I'll note to you that the red values represent the genetic correlations, and the purple or blue values on the lower part of the diagonal or below the diagonal represent, the phenotypic data. Okay. Some of the things that stood out, so this is from quadrant 1, front hoof angle and heel depth got a strong genetic correlation of about 0.9, phenotypically about 0.8, front and rear hoof angle and heel depth, strong genetic associations all above 0.85, so really quite connected, more so than we even hypothesized. Rear hoof angle and rear heel depth to front hoof angle and hoof heel depth, substantially lower phenotypic correlations, but still really strong genetically. Heel depth and front and rear genetic correlation of about 0.86. So this lends some validity to systems that score front and rear hoof angle and heel depth concurrently, so they don't separate those into front and rear traits. I think that's a perfectly legitimate approach given how strong these genetic associations are. Claw shape, 0.75 correlation with front and rear. So again, really supports, in many cases, the combining of front and rear phenotypes together for an evaluation system. Here's quadrant 2, so that upper right bit of genetic correlations. Some interesting stuff between body condition score and knee orientation and hoof orientation. So the animals that tended to be more correct in their foot had better body condition scores, the way this particular scoring rubric works out, which we thought was kind of interesting. Some other ones, hoof angle and front side view as an indicator trait, correlation of about 0.45, and somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6 when we look at front foot attributes to rear limb attributes. And then rear hoof angle and heel depth here related to side view. So how does hip and hock set affect foot attributes? And those genetic correlations being between 0.5 and 0.7. Yeah. Among the traits that had a big influence on our overall composite score, hoof angle and heel depth had a pretty big influence on that as well. So genetic correlations between 0.4 and 0.6. Lastly, here on the set of genetic correlations, rear claw shape, so related to front limb, knee orientation and hoof orientation about 0.4, and rear side view about minus 0.36. So lots of indicator data that may be useful in our evaluation. Here's the phenotypic correlations. All of these ended up being substantially lower than any of the genetic associations we observed. And in particular here, our rear side view and rear view with hoof angle on the rear, only around 0.2 phenotypic correlations. So we were lucky, I guess, that the genetic association sorted out as good as they did. So with that, we'll go into this last little bit, section 4. A few things to kind of highlight here. the front limb orientations, so knee and foot turn out or turn in, with front side view and knee orientation. So that pair of traits pretty strongly related, either favorably or unfavorably, depending on how you look at it, but strong genetic associations nonetheless. And then here, knee orientation and front hoof orientation with rear side view, modest negative association. So in some cases, we observed animals that tended to be straighter on the front end had more set to the hock on the rear end, which we thought was interesting. And then finally here, front side view had a strong genetic association with our overall composite score. So that's primarily a measure of shoulder angle. So if we thought an animal was really straight shouldered, that had a tendency to negatively affect their composite score. Lastly here, the rear view, more set to their hock, negative influence on their composite score, so they're viewed as less structurally sound, just like you might expect. So here in conclusion, what we found was that feet and leg traits have low to moderate heritability. We were encouraged by even a relatively small data set that we were able to get solutions for all those that landed well within the literature estimates from larger data sets. We had useful indicator data obtainable from the limb information. So we think including those as part of a genetic evaluation may be helpful, particularly in cases where scoring animals for really fine attributes on the foot in maybe adverse conditions in terms of mud or pasture setting, capturing those limb angles is quite a bit easier. And lastly here, that if we place selection pressure on these traits using an effective tool, we'll be able to make some genetic progress to improve feet and leg quality in beef cattle. So with that, I'm glad to hang around, and Derek, if it's all right, we can do questions all at the end. But appreciate everybody listening, and we'll keep on moving.
Sounds good, Bob. If you don't care, while you two are kind of switching over, let me ask you real quick.
Okay.
Is there a breed that's actually currently looking at implementing it? Is Red Angus thinking about implementing it, or are we still a ways away from that?
Yeah, so we're in active dialogue with both the elected leadership and staff at Red Angus. And one of our obligations in the project is provide a recommendation on the scoring system that they should implement. And so Lane Geis, a master's student here that's also working in this project, is conducting an analysis now that looks at basically collapsing our continuous scoring system into several different categorical systems to see how much information we lose in either heritabilities or genetic correlations as we go from that sort of 0 to 100 scale to say a 1 to 10 or a 1 to 5 scoring system. We want to make it easy for breeders to submit the data, and sometimes the finer you make that, it either makes it more difficult or more inclined to be biased or have an error associated with it as you're trying to make it too fine. So we're actively pursuing that prototype as we speak. Anticipate having that recommendation by year end.
Okay, sounds good. We're going to move on. I see that Bruce has a question. You might take a look at that question and be ready to answer it after Heather's done, if that sounds all right to everybody. And we'll go ahead and pick up. Our next speaker is Dr. Heather Bradford, and Heather's from Central Ohio, and she actually went to Purdue University for her bachelor's degree, ended up getting her master's at K-State, and then something we have in common is she got her PhD from the University of Georgia, and I think is still there now working on a postdoc. She's had a very successful graduate career, winning the Roy Wallace Scholarship Award, and also won the Frank Baker Award a couple of times from BIF. And so some of her work while she was at K-State was looking at the teat and udder score EPDs, and so she's going to bring us kind of up to date on her research and some of the possibilities for us getting some EPDs on teat and udder scores. So Heather, I will turn it over to you, and we appreciate you being here today.
Thanks, Dare. I appreciate the introduction to talk and invitation to talk today. I was a little surprised when I was asked to talk about this topic. It's been a few years since I completed this research at K-State, but it's also something I always get questions about at BIF every year, so it's still certainly important to the industry. And I think Dr. Weber did a great job of introducing kind of the importance of some of these convenience traits. So to start off with, I'd like to acknowledge Kansas State. As you heard, this is some of the research I did while I worked on my master's here with Drs. Mosier, Weber, and Borman. In addition, Shane Bedwell at the American Hereford Association provided some updated numbers on their current evaluation for these traits. And also Ryan Bolt, who's a PhD student at Colorado State, and Larry Keenan at the Red Angus Association of America provided some preliminary results on some of these traits that they're looking at in Red Angus. So with that, I'll go into a little bit of the importance of kind of udder type. It will start off in the cow. And we can think about longevity. If we have cows with better udder quality, they're going to stay in the herd longer. According to some USDA data, about 3% of cull cows are culled because of udder problems. And that's, of course, going to be more important in our older cows. And udder type is also related to the risk of that cow developing mastitis, especially when cows have very weak udder suspension. That udder's hanging lower, closer to the ground, and likely coming into contact with some more fecal matter, more bacteria, so we have a greater risk of that cow developing an infection. And some studies, it's been in the early 2000s, found the decreases in weaning weight by upwards of 50 pounds when those females had mastitis. So it's certainly something that's economically important for producers. If we look at the calf side, the big thing here is going to be labor. If producers have to assist those calves to nurse when they're born, because cows have maybe very pendulous udder suspension, the calf doesn't want to put its head down that low, or really either extreme in terms of teat size. Extremely large teats will be hard for the calf to grasp. Extremely short can also have the same problem. We can also have some greater calf mortality because we had to intervene and assist that calf. The calf probably consumed colostrum later, and so likely we have greater mortality rates in those calves, particularly related to cows with very large teats. And there's also some research that shows that udder size is related to calf growth, where cows with smaller udders and smaller teats had calves that grew less. So that's certainly something we want to think about as we think about, in most breeds, we have very strong, rapid increasing weaning weights. What is that doing to the genetics of our cows in terms of udder quality? So how do we measure these traits? The BIF has produced guidelines for scoring udder suspension and teat size. Both of these are going to be subjective scores on a 1 through 9 scoring system. It's recommended they're recorded within the first 24 hours after calving, so a producer can easily record these as they're recording birth weights, and should be based on the poorest quality quarter. So if a cow has one teat that's much larger than the others, that's the quarter that should be scored. And ideally evaluated by one person within a herd just to maintain some consistency, or at least if there are multiple people scoring cows in a herd, that they kind of come to a consensus on how they're going to score those cows. And the thing to really keep in mind is the ranking of those cows is actually much more important than the actual score. So whether I score my cows 7s, 8s, and 9s, or 5s, 6s, and 7s, it doesn't really matter as long as I'm really identifying the differences in those cows so that the better cows have a higher score. Just a brief history on the measurement of these traits at the American Hereford Association. This is going to differ a little bit from most breeds because they historically have collected data on what we're going to call an overall udder score for just one trait for a number of years. In 2008, the BIF recommended recording these 2 traits, and after that, the American Hereford Association switched to recording now udder suspension and teat size, and have since 2008. So here's that first overall scoring system that was used for many years. Again, we have 9 being kind of the more ideal case, where we have cows with smaller teats and tighter udder suspension. And as that score decreases, we see an increase in teat size and a decrease in the tightness of that udder suspension, the udders becoming more pendulous. And then here's the BIF scoring system for, again, we have udder suspension and teat size, where scores of 9 are going to be very tight suspension or very small teats, and 1s will be very pendulous suspension or very large teats. There's just a little bit of history on the research of these traits in the beef industry. In the early 2000s, the American Gelbvieh Association had some research done at the University of Georgia. And looking at their scoring system, they also used a little bit different scoring system in the beginning. Then the American Hereford Association in 2012, I started working on that data set, and most of the results I'm going to present today are from that study. If there's no specific breed listed on the results, you can assume it's from the Hereford data. And then most recently, the Red Angus Association, in collaboration with Colorado State, is working on some analyses of these traits. So that's something you can look for in the future. Ryan Bolt is working on that, and something that'll be kind of coming out in this area in the near future. So here's just some descriptive statistics from the Hereford and Red Angus data. For Hereford, for the newer traits, we have about 260,000 records, and about 300,000 of those historical records on the overall scores. Those are from their current evaluation this fall. At Red Angus, they're using about 50,000 records for research, so it's not necessarily comparing apples to apples in terms of numbers of records, but both of these breeds are certainly doing their part to establish large databases for these traits. I think the one main interesting difference is the difference in standard deviation between the 2 breeds. We do see a little bit more phenotypic variability in the Red Angus. It'll be interesting to see if there are any different results in the Red Angus data than compared with the Hereford. So here's a distribution of what those scores look like in the Hereford data. So we have the scoring system here on the x-axis, 1 being the more pendulous suspension and larger teats, 9 being the tighter suspension and smaller teats. And you can see there's really very few records less than 5. The vast majority of those are kind of 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And we see very similar trends for all 3 of those traits that have been measured over time. I just want to briefly discuss the model that's used specifically at the AHA. So we have these 3 traits that have been recorded. We're going to use the data for all 3 of those traits in our national cattle evaluation. And the output of that evaluation is going to be udder suspension and teat size EPDs. So those overall scores are essentially functioning as an indicator trait, much like ultrasound data would in a carcass evaluation. They're really going to provide some information on historical animals kind of prior to the change in the scoring systems in 2008. So as we get further from that time, those overall scores are going to continue to become less and less important, but we're still gaining some valuable information from those at this time in terms of predicting genetic merit for the other 2 traits. So like I said, this is a multiple trait model. We of course have a genetic effect and also a permanent environment. These are traits that we can repeatedly score on the same cows. So we're going to be able to account for that in our model. And of course have a contemporary group and the age of the cow when she calves. First, I want to look at repeatability. So repeatability is the correlation between repeated records on the same cow. So in the Hereford data in the table, we see repeatabilities of about 0.5 for all 3 traits. And some line 1 Hereford data from Miles City and the Red Angus data, those repeatabilities are much less, closer to 0.3. So if the repeatability was 0.9, that would tell us that one score on a cow was pretty sufficient to establish her genetic merit. But here we have repeatabilities less than 0.5. So that means if we can score cows multiple times, we're going to add accuracy to our genetic evaluation. So here I have the number of records per cow. You can see that the vast majority of these cows only have one record, and part of that may be because of the switch in the scoring systems. And this was based on some older data, so it could be that now we have more records per cow as we've had that system at the AHA for a few more years. But it's important to keep in mind we should be scoring all cows within a herd, and we should be scoring them every year just to maintain some accuracy for our EPDs. Next, we'll look at heritability. The heritabilities for all of these traits are right around 0.3. And comparing the Hereford and the Angus data, or the Red Angus data, we see almost identical heritabilities. So certainly moderately heritable, and something we can definitely select for and see some change in our herds. So the next thing we'll look at is the genetic correlation. So we'll start off looking at those overall scores. Those are our indicator trait, and we see correlations of about 0.7 with both of the newer traits. So those are very strong and positive. They're essentially measuring more or less the same trait, so we're getting some value from those overall scores. And then looking at the correlation between the two new traits, we see about 0.83 in Hereford, 0.95 in some of that Gelbvieh data, and 0.8 in Red Angus. So those are all very strong positive correlations. They're essentially measuring the same trait. And we see that across breeds. So what about the implementation at the AHA? In 2013, they released some research EPDs on their proven bulls. In the spring of 2015, they first implemented their full genetic evaluation for both udder suspension and teat size. And this past fall, the Canadian Hereford Association joined that evaluation. So they added about 7,000 Canadian records to this evaluation, and that was something Canada was very eager to participate in. As you heard from Bruce a couple weeks ago, the AHA plans to switch their evaluation system next month, and with that switch will be the first genomically enhanced EPDs for these two traits. So that's certainly something to be excited about in terms of selecting younger animals for these udder traits. It's not something that we can measure early in life, so it's a trait where genomics can really help us, particularly when we're selecting yearling bulls. So just a few comments on the EPDs that come out of this. If you remember, I like to think back to the scoring system. We have the two traits. Scores of 9s were tight suspension or small teats. 1s were pendulous suspension and large teats. So if we think about the EPDs, a larger EPD is going to correspond to tighter suspension or smaller teats. And likewise, a smaller EPD will be more pendulous suspension and larger teats. Now, an EPD of 1 isn't necessarily correlated to 1 on the scoring system, but rather we need to think about the relative differences just like any other EPD. So here's just an example of two bulls with EPDs for these traits, and I've also included breed average here as a reference. If we look at udder suspension first, we expect bull A's daughters to be 1 score tighter in terms of suspension than B's daughters, because we have a 1 unit difference in those two EPDs. If we then look at teat size, B is 0.5 larger than A, so we expect bull B's daughters to be a half a score smaller for teat size. So it's all about the differences between these EPDs, either between animals or compared with breed average. One interesting thing that's happened at the American Hereford Association is since publishing these EPDs, they've seen an increase in phenotype reporting. So here I have the year on the x-axis and the number of cows that were phenotyped for the udder traits on the y-axis. You see it was pretty constant early on at about 40,000 cows per year. And then there's been a steady increase for a number of years. This research was very widely publicized by the AHA to their membership. And so we do see an increase during the research phase and when those research EPDs were available in 2013 and 2014. With the implementation of their full genetic evaluation in 2015, we see again another pretty sharp increase in phenotype reporting. So now there's somewhere around 55,000 cows scored per year. Now, the AHA typically has about 100,000 cows on whole herd inventory every year. So we're looking at about half or a little more of their cows are being scored. So it's certainly something a large number of producers find valuable enough to be recording this data and reporting it to the association. Here's the genetic trend for both of these traits. You see the trend follows a very similar pattern for both traits. The y-axis here is the units of the udder scoring system. So smaller numbers again are looser suspension and larger teats. Larger numbers are tighter suspension and smaller teats. And we can see in the past about 15 years, we've seen about a 0.2 increase in those scores. And this is all still due to phenotypic selection. I'd like to say that kind of this graph getting a little steeper in recent years was because of the EPDs, but we're really not far enough out to see that yet. So it'll be interesting to see what this does over the next few years as producers had access to those EPDs and are starting to score some of those females that were selected from those EPDs. Just want to mention some things that maybe we don't know as much about right now. And one of those is correlations with other traits. A couple studies agree that udder type and milk production are moderately negatively correlated. So that means as we have cows that produce more milk, we can expect to have more udder problems. We know we have increasing genetic trends for milk production in a large number of our breeds. So there's perhaps some concern what that might do to udder quality. There's also potentially a relationship between udder type and weaning weight. One study says it's negative, one says positive. So that's something where we need a little bit more research to understand the relationship between calf growth and the udder type of the cow. And there could also be some interesting relationships with some of our reproductive and longevity traits, and because these traits are related to how long we keep a cow in the herd. And it's important to understand these relationships as we think about incorporating udder traits into a multiple trait selection scheme, and what's the relative importance of these traits as we move forward. So I want to kind of wrap up with a couple of challenges that I see in terms of these traits. A big one is we have a lot of contemporary groups that have no variation for both traits. I don't have an exact percent for the Hereford data, but in Red Angus, it's something like 50%. And in the Hereford data, that really means that producers are saying all of their cows have perfect udders. They're typically all scored 9. And so if you're taking the time to kind of record these traits and submit the data to the association, it's really doing a disservice to the commercial producers and your customers when you're not really taking the time to rank those females in your herd, and it's really not aiding in the genetic evaluation of these traits. One other thing that's a problem in the Hereford data is a lot of producers submit the same score for both traits. And I realize some of that might be from submitting those legacy kind of overall scores that now they have 2 boxes, so they just submit the same score in both. That's something I think we could encourage more to really score these traits separately. I realize it's probably more common that a cow with a really good udder has a 9 for both traits, but I think it's less likely that kind of an average cow has scored 7 for both. And I think that's something we need to address in terms of producers reporting data. And then the other thing that I just mentioned, thinking about incorporating udder traits into multiple trait selection schemes. So with that, I just have a few conclusions. These traits are generally moderately heritable with a heritability around 0.3. And they're probably traits where there's kind of an intermediate optimum where we don't necessarily want the really extreme on the kind of top end, because maybe we sacrifice some milk production, and maybe there's some undesirable correlations with some other traits. It's important to keep in mind, it's good to have more records per cow, so we can add some accuracy to those EPDs. And we could use a little bit of improvement on the education system for the scoring system and recording the data for these traits. And so with that, I appreciate everyone listening in today, and Dr. Weber and I'd be happy to take any more questions.
Thanks, Heather. That was really good. Appreciate that. Yeah, the fact that we're a little bit behind on getting you on here is our fault, not your fault. So, but I have a question for you on the multiple records part of it. Is there not an optimum age? How do you handle that? Because I mean, certainly those scores are going to be, I mean, I guess with contemporary grouping, but the scores are going to be vastly different between that 2-year-old and a 7-year-old.
Right, and the age of the cow at calving is included in that model, so we can kind of account for the age of that cow. Larry Keene did some research with the US mark data on differences between 2- and 5-year-olds, and he really didn't see very big differences in the variance components at those different ages.
Okay. Bob, if you want to switch over, we can get back to the question that Bruce had. It says that Donald Brown answered it live, but I don't think Donald did, so I'm going to let you answer it. And it says, out of curiosity, were the results full genetic covariance matrix in the parameter space, all positive eigenvalues?
Ask the question again.
Okay, you can click on your thing. I think it's in the questions part, the Q&A part, but it says, out of curiosity, were the resulting full genetic covariance matrix in the parameter space? In other words, were they all positive eigenvalues?
Good question. So when we started off trying to solve that system of equations as basically a giant 14 trait model, and it would not converge. And so we ended up going back and doing the pairwise traits to get stability in those solutions. But when we did that, all of the resulting covariances solved within the space.
Okay. And then Scott Newman asked, are the composite scores the ideal EPD?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think we talked about that as the students and I were driving back and forth to a fair number of spots, and one of the things that we sort of decided was that there's still, even when we were scoring, what one of us thought was ideal and what somebody else thought was ideal was pretty easy to talk about, but at the end of the day, what we wanted to try and do is make sure we scored against the rubric, and left the 50 as ideal is pretty subjective, but we can be more objective if we say, okay, let's just try and match the rubric. And I think the best way to describe what's the best EPD or the best score ultimately goes back to which one in some selection index context has the most value. And we're obviously a long ways from doing that. But ultimately, if the traits have economic importance, we should be able to sort that out. Dr. Bradford, fair?
Fair.
Fair? Okay.
I have a perhaps related question. Have you thought about kind of implementation of an EPD? And these are traits where the extremes are generally pretty undesirable. What might that look like? Yeah,
so we've talked about that a little bit, and one of the challenges we've run into really is this idea that, and Heather spoke to it a little bit, that it's an intermediate optimum trait. And so running a strict set of correlations between our feet and leg composite score, or feet and leg scores, so individual traits, against something like stability, produces some kind of nonsensical results. And so we've thought about strategies to transform that data such that the the ends of the tails are undesirable. If we take the absolute values, say, of the EPDs, that provides some sort of from worst to best or best to worst sort of categorical or continuous distribution of the EPD that we might then, so it's now kind of a linear relationship with another trait, investigate that. But that makes it a fairly complicated set of values to kind of interpret. And, you know, getting at what producers ought to use to select for, I think is important, but complicated, because our zero value represents some population mean, and those aren't a long ways typically when we go back and look at the phenotypic scores of those animals, not a long ways from 50 per se, but without some, you know, good advice on you know, what the economic consequence is, it's a little arbitrary to say, you know, should we select for animals that are minus 0.1 for shoulder angle, or should we select for ones that are 0? I don't know. It's a good question.
All right. Another question, Bob, was asked, have you considered looking at the substance of bone?
That's a good question. And what we talked about that a little bit, and sort of what we came down to was a bit more of the idea of how big the feet are, because a lot of times that's can be a reasonable indicator, but sometimes we see animals that are, I'm going to step away from my animal breeder day job and talk about, if you go to the show ring and look at some of the club calf cattle, they have tons of bone and really small feet that make them really unsound. And so we didn't evaluate substance of bone, because if we go in the commercial side of the sector, bone represents loss at the carcass end, and so we weren't particularly interested in selecting for more or less bone. We wanted them good structured and good feet.
Okay, I'm trying to take these in order, but let me go back because Sandy's got another one.
We're popular. This is awesome.
Yep. So
controversial. Either way, I'm happy.
Sandy Johnson was asking, remind me if the composite score was calculated from other scores or assigned.
It was assigned. So when we got all the other ones done, the very last piece of data we recorded was, as the observer, give this animal a 0 to 50 score on our view, are they structurally correct or not? And we did that principally because we wanted to start to investigate from an observer's perspective what things drive our view of structural correctness. So one of the things that Lane's doing is going back on the phenotypic scale and doing some multiple regression analysis to see which one of those traits phenotypically drove our composite score. And you can see a little bit of it in our genetic correlations between composite score and other traits. Shoulder angle, hock set, and heel depth were the three big ones.
Okay. Donald, yep. Donald, I've got you in line, but I'm going to just read a statement that Michael Sleeper sent out real quick, and then I'm going to ask Donald's question. Michael said, on the question of age of the evaluation, from the dairy background, 2-year-olds are best due to most complete non-selected animal group. As stated, relative score and rank do not change materially over time. So, any comments back on that, Heather?
I would not disagree with that. One of the things that we observed, and we don't have a ton of data, but in general, the mean values for animals that were older, as they got older, their scores got closer to 50. How about that? I hesitate to say more desirable, but what we suspect is there is some culling going on as animals age, obviously, on these traits. And fortunately for our evaluation, a bulk of the data came from yearlings to 3-year-olds. So.
And I'm assuming that would apply on the udder as well.
I would maybe disagree a little bit because if you think about cows aging, their udder quality is perhaps going to decline a little more. And I think maybe we see a little bit more differences in older cows versus 2-year-olds.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna get to Donald's question now, and it's long, so stick with me. My question is about how to most consistently score the teats and udders. Has anyone looked at scoring them at calf branding by allowing the cows to bag up while the calves are being worked for a certain amount of time, say 5 hours, and then score the cows? What would be the pros and cons of measuring the cattle at that point in time? Then he's got a follow-up.
I think that's a really important thing to think about. For me personally, it's really hard to kind of score a cow when she calves and still kind of rank my cows correctly. So I think that's potentially a pretty good solution to that. The only thing is, maybe those teats don't look quite as big, but if all the cows are kind of treated similarly, that's potentially viable. There is one producer I know of who will take videos of their cows when they calve, and then after the calving season, go back and look at those and then score all of their cows on the same day. So granted, that's probably not practical on a large scale. That's certainly a way to overcome some of the challenges in kind of recording those consistently over a calving season.
And his follow-up is which time of scoring at calving versus at branding provide the most consistent udder fill and nutritional input that influences milk flow throughout the calving season?
In terms of scoring, I would think at calving would be the most consistent, but perhaps it's maybe a little bit difficult also if cows have a lot of udder swelling. Maybe that's throwing off some of our scores. If the cows that are heavier milkers have more swelling, then maybe they look worse than they actually will be. But it's also the kind of the economically important time is at calving. That's when calves are really going to have the most trouble if those cows' teats are too large.
I guess I'd follow up with that too, Heather, is that you're going to have a lot of age difference on the calves. In other words, the point of lactation might influence that as well.
So maybe that's something K-State would like to look at in the future.
Yeah, maybe. That's a good question.
Okay. As far as I'm seeing, that looks like all the questions I have here. Does anybody else have anything else that they would like to point out or share? Be thinking of it or be typing, and I'll just remind everybody that session 4 is next week. This is kind of a little bit of a divergence for us. This is the first time that we kind of wanted to, we've been spewing all the information the other direction, and we kind of wanted to get some feedback the other way. And so the title of this one is Cattlemen's Take on Where National Cattle Evaluation Should Be Going. We as scientists and educators have our perspectives, and we wanted to get this perspective from the other side. We're going to get a seed stock perspective from Donald Brown, R.A. Brown Ranch, and a commercial perspective from Tom Woodward at Prosecco Land and Cattle Company. So I am excited to have to watch the recording next week because I'm going to be on a plane during the presentations, but I'm really looking forward to that. We're also going to have Dr. Mark Enns that's going to bring us up to date and give us our invitation on the BIF for 2018 that's going to be held at Colorado State, or Colorado State's hosting. It's going to be in Loveland, and this is going to be the 50th anniversary of BIF. So Mark's going to give us an invitation and kind of an update on what's going on there. Any more questions, anybody? I'm not seeing anything pop up. Bob and Heather, really appreciate you guys participating today and giving us some excellent presentations on some traits that we haven't heard a lot about. So I really appreciate that from you two.
Great. Thanks, Dare.
You betcha. All right, everybody. It looks like everybody's gone cold on us, so we're going to shut this down and stop the recording, and appreciate it.